the span of 3 days, 3 terrorist or terrorist-related attacks, a siege in Pakistan that claimed the lives of 141, mostly school children. In Australia and also in Belgium, 2 hostage-taking incidents with political motives, which involved terrorists. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula struck again, assassinating a leading political figure, Salim Ghufayna. Also in Saudi Arabia, another hostage-taking drama involved terrorists. And of course, the ISIL terrorist onslaught in Iraq and in Syria. And these are incidents that are being reported. So why has the war on terrorism failed? Why, despite all the billions of dollars in the so-called war on terror, terrorists are flourishing more than ever before, spreading to European countries and also threatening the United States? Those questions and a whole lot more in this edition of The Debate. Stay tuned.
It's only more than a fortnight before the new year, but December is being marked with bloodstains all over. The drama started before midday when a handful of militants wearing military uniforms stormed an army-run school in Peshawar, one of Pakistan's volatile cities right on the Afghan border.
Today we had a chemistry paper exam. As I finished my paper and I was sitting inside a lab, firing started. As the firing started, militants entered and opened fire on all of the students. They killed a 2-year-old child.
Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, a pro-Taliban insurgent group, has claimed responsibility for Tuesday's carnage, described by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif as a national tragedy. It was the deadliest ever terror attack in troubled Pakistan.
There are insurgent organizations, and insurgent organizations about undermining the state. And by attacking a school, you are really demonstrating the government's lack of ability to even protect its own children.
TTP was founded in 2007, based in a large strip of land near the Afghan border called Federally Administered Tribal Areas, FATA. It has strong links with Afghan Taliban and is seeking to oust the government in Islamabad to create its own ruling. Pretty much the same agenda the ISIL is pursuing in Syria and Iraq. The armed insurgency in Syria, broken out in mid-2011, paved the way for the terror group's birth. But it didn't come to exist on its own. The lifeline of ammunition to the armed groups trying to overthrow the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad came and continued to come from the West and several regional Arab countries opposing Assad's government. What they didn't see coming was that their all-out support could haunt them back in their own countries. Take into account the fatal hostage situation in Sydney, where a gunman, radicalized through the years he spent in Australia, raised the flag of Al-Nusra Front, another armed group active in Syria. He had praised the ISIL actions too. Or the 32-year-old Canadian man Michael Zihaf Bibu, who infiltrated into the Canadian Parliament in October. He came so close to the doorsteps of Premier's door. Authorities said he sought to go to Syria to join the ISIL. Both these two strikes have been described as lone wolf attacks, where one gunman, sympathizing with the terrorist ideology, stages a dramatic situation overseas, mostly in countries which had thrown their support behind the same terrorists in the Middle East. The worst support is now backfiring. Probably the world thought it could contain this crawling snake inside the Mideast cages, but now it's rising and transcending geographical borders.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Debate. We have journalist and Middle East analyst Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, who joins us from London. And from New York, we have Peter Sennett. He's an independent scholar. I'd like to welcome you both. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, let me start with you. This horrible massacre that occurred in Peshawar in Pakistan, the Taliban claiming responsibility. They cited the reason being the government operations to eradicate extremists from the North Waziristan tribal area. Now, this is an area that's been rife with terrorists. It's been targeted now for the past 4 months, and now we have this attack. What was your initial reaction?
Well, it's a clear-cut case of a terror attack, and it makes perfect sense in that context because We've seen that the Taliban and their actions have increased over the past few years. The American presence has almost fueled their actions and allowed them to sort of spread even further beyond Afghanistan into the Pakistan border. Now, just to reiterate about the news passage that you showed, there are cases. This is a clear-cut case of a terror attack. It had a political motivation. The responsibility was claimed by the Taliban. They were targeting the military. I mean, although it was a military academy, they were targeting the military. So there was a very clear political element to this terrorist attack. I think when you look at the hostage crisis in Sydney, this was a very deranged individual who seemed very unaware of where he stands religiously or even politically. And I think had he been a white Westerner, we would have claimed that he was just insane. It would have been very similar to the attacks we've seen in US high schools or in shopping malls. So I think we need to differentiate between what is a terrorist attack, and I think the one in Peshawar is very much a case of a terrorist attack, and something very different, which is the case in Sydney.
Well, that's what we're going to try to do in this debate. And Peter said one of the things that our guest there from London said, and that's the fact that the U.S. occupation in Afghanistan has fueled insurgency. Why would it do that? And do you agree?
North and South has been the main area for the Taliban after their retreat from Afghanistan. So what we are seeing is the stronghold of the Taliban under attack by the Pakistan military for a few years now. And that dates back to the U.S. Presence in Afghanistan militarily as well. But this is something that is also within Pakistani society. So in one sense, we're close to a civil war, in a sense, between different ideologies and views of the world in Pakistan, and on the other hand, it's a continuation of what the Taliban's fight to really take on the Pakistan military and the Pakistan government.
Well, let's look, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, at the different types of terrorist attacks that are taking place. And if you were to maybe do a comparative analysis between what is going on, and I want to say at the present time, but present being maybe that would be too short-lived, I should say in the past year or two, as opposed to the years before, and maybe I should go back to since 9/11. Do you feel there's been an increase in terrorist activities around the world, given the fact that there's been a push with this anti-terror operation worldwide, or do you feel that that's not the case prior to 9/11?
Absolutely. I think instead of calling it the war on terror, I think it should now be labeled the war of terror. It is an enterprise that has actually fueled terrorism and radical Islamism almost in every corner of the planet, whereby it used to be confined to very specific parts of the world and to very small extreme groups. These groups have spread as a result of a very irresponsible American foreign policy that has endeavored to actually encourage, fuel, and in the case of Syria, fund these terror groups. So I think it's very much a case of seeing that as a result of 9/11, from the Middle East to Africa to Central Asia and further afield. I think we've seen attacks as well in Europe, and we're likely to see more because this phenomenon has spread, and it has spread thanks to the war of terror.
We're going to talk a little bit about the support that has been given to some of these terrorist groups, but Peter Senat, I'm sure you're aware of the United States Central Command. It was established back in 1983, the area of responsibility, the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, most notably Afghanistan and Iraq, and you have forces from CENTCOM currently deployed in many of these countries. I'm looking at a list of countries here, and of course you could add to that. I'm not too sure if you add to that the 700 U.S. military bases, or is that part of the CENTCOM, which is a sprawling web basically of U.S. presence in terms of forces all around the world. Why are they not able to stop these terrorists? I'm guessing there's 10 times more soldiers than these terrorists.
Well, if you look at the case of the New York Times reporter David Rode, who was kidnapped by a Taliban or a Taliban-associated group and spent some time on the inside getting to see how suicide bombers came about, the kind of shows that the radical Islamists, the movies they watched, the YouTube videos, you saw a tremendous emphasis on violence, and some of that is the responsibility of Hollywood. So you have a Hollywood that has been churning out an incredible level of violent-oriented films where the anti-hero is the contrarian who goes against the tide. And I think these sorts of films are filtering also throughout the world. So I think the U.S. has embedded a culture of violence via its Hollywood successes that is interpreted by many as a psychological state that is preferable, that you should be in. So when I find out that these are the kinds of videos, besides the Islamist suicide videos and things like that, it's what they're watching, it's the to become someone who's going to kill people and then ultimately be killed. And a lot of it, I think, is the sense of the camera and the fame or infamy that goes along with it. So I think the U.S. cannot control and anticipate a lot of things. It doesn't have the ability to avoid a lot of things. So it is the watcher more than the doer. But where I would put American responsibility is this culture of Hollywood violence that is exported throughout the world, and is one of the common threads that you find among these people that will shoot up schools in the United States and so on, as well as some of the Islamists in Waziristan. There is a clear sense that they have enjoyed this exposure to these kinds of films. So we have built a broader culture of violence, of which Islamist jihad is one factor and a very big factor, but we have to realize that it's affecting other people, and we're seeing this incredible violence occurring by lone wolf, as they say sometimes, terrorists, on a more and more often. It's breeding it. Each act breeds another act. So we're at a very serious stage, and the Peshawar, it's also, they did attack children. So, you know, these are not adults that were the target, it was the children of the military that they were targeting. So this is a sense of lowering the bar, of saying that anything is okay.
Yeah, but what's not okay is what Hollywood has done in some sense, or maybe the Western, I guess, TV and media inclusive there in the States, and that is the fact that you call them Islamists. There's a differentiation to be made between Islamists and extremists, even though they may turn out to be Muslim, but then Muslims don't go out and chop heads and eat liver. Kara-Mustapha, regarding the support by the United States, I mean, some of these allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, 9/11, U.S. looked the other way. And currently, well, Saudi Arabia is still those countries, but yet these are countries that are supporting these terrorists. So by default, doesn't that make the U.S. guilty?
Either way, the responsibility of the U.S. is very clear. I would agree probably with my fellow panelists with the role of Hollywood to a certain extent, but of course we need to go and see beyond the bigger picture, which is that the Wahhabi ideology is very much responsible for brainwashing a lot of these young Muslims into some sort of very extreme form of ideology that finds some inspiration in religious texts, but of course takes it's a very warped interpretation that it essentially targets first and foremost fellow Muslims anyway, and then seems to make no discrimination between any target. So again, yes, the military target in Peshawar was essentially a political one. It was a military target, but of course it was a school which housed and schooled many children. I think the responsibility of the US and its allies, namely the Gulf countries of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, is very much at the heart of this issue. And I think that the rise of this form of political Islam, and it's in its extreme form, can actually be traced back to the Wahhabism and the funds that were invested by Saudi Arabia as early as the sort of late 70s, early 80s. Resulted in a lot of the things that we see today.
Very well. Good time to take a break. Let's see what our viewer thinks. They posted their comments on our Facebook page. And after we listen to that, we're going to come back to the debate.
The US-led war on terror is a failure, as the continually rising terrorist attacks have illustrated. The answer is obvious. This extremism serves American interests. It is always American interests. Everything else must serve them. Fake wars with fake enemies created to justify military spending equals fantasy and speculation, which equals fascism. There's no such thing as war on terror. We are too far to be deceived. Because that is the real goal of the war on terror, to create more terrorists. Excellent question. Here is my 2 cents worth. The American war industry needs a constant supply of enemies to maintain its staggering profits. The industry controls foreign policy. How hard is it to manufacture a group of terrorists? The US did it successfully in Afghanistan by creating the Taliban to fight the Soviets, who by all accounts were helping the establishment of education and USA.
Just some of the viewer comments there. I think, Peter Sennett, if I'm not mistaken, this could be one reason, the American war industry. Wasn't there a book that was written a while back, dates back to the 50s, this notion that if America was at war, it would support the economy? And I remember looking at some footage of families, American families, going to these trade shows back in the 50s with airplanes and war-related different types of items there being displayed. Is there a war industry that needs to be maintained?
Well, President Eisenhower was the first one to name and write about the dangers of the military-industrial complex being too great a part of the economy or to affect foreign policy. The United States military industry is just one of many in the world that are large. The Chinese, nobody speaks about China's huge military industry, which is very political in who it gives its arms to, nor Russia, which supports Syria and Assad regimes. So the Russians' role and the role of China, especially in their support. No, they don't have 700 bases, but I don't know if they have that many, but I doubt they would be very large. There aren't that many large bases abroad. So it's really, it's what's considered a base is something that maybe served as one for a short period, but really has no function today. But is obviously involved in the war on terrorism, and the war on terrorism is a very large part of American foreign policy since September 11th. When we started to look very closely at where did the Taliban get their arms, and we found that China was one of the main suppliers, that's obviously affected the United States' stance. So the war on terror, the way from the U.S. view, is that, hey, we kept out of it completely for some years. We stopped getting and being involved in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and what happened? What happened is the Taliban and their rise to power and their advocacy of terrorism. So the United States, a lot of people feel that it was exactly because we disengaged so completely from the politics of Afghanistan and Pakistan and having really no aid or hardly any presence at all. And this is why this could serve as such a large base for attacks upon the United States.
But wait a minute. But when you say the U.S. was disengaged, that's when you didn't have as many attacks. Isn't that true, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha? So that's what we're trying to figure out over here. And at the same time, I'd like to ask you, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, I don't know how to ask this. What would happen if the U.S. would stop trying to police the world? Or why is it that the U.S. is policing the world and its effect on terrorism?
Well, this is something that I've said so many times, is every single US intervention has led to more bloodshed and to more problems. And there isn't a single case whereby American foreign intervention has actually improved a very bad situation. So I think if America actually ceased to try and police the world, which actually it's not policing, it's actually just turning the world into a much more disturbed place to live in, I think if it invested that kind of money in reducing poverty in its own country, in perhaps policing, training its own police forces not to indiscriminately kill ethnic minorities, then maybe the world would be a better place. I think it seems to me that for the best part of 150 years, the US has been built on creating enemies, and I think it rallies, the people rally around the idea of a bogeyman. Now, we've had communism for the best part of 70 years, whereby there was this constant threat of a nuclear war, of the Cold War and everything. And of course, when the Berlin Wall collapsed and communist countries ceased to be communist, there was just a strong desire to find a new enemy. And that was found in some Arab leaders, and of course that eventually morphed into also Al-Qaeda. So there's this desperate desire to create foes, inflate their potency in order to fuel the military-industrial complex. Now, the problem with that is that you create a monster, you think that you can actually control it, but of course monsters grow and they become out of control. And this is what we've seen with many of these radical groups that were initially funded and under the control of the US. That was very much the case in Syria. I mean, Western countries were funding it, were funding the Islamist group, as it were. And of course now they've gone beyond any form of control, and we've seen them morph into ISIL, ISIS, whatever it's called. You know, this nihilist, very radical group that chops heads and slaughters Muslims, essentially, across the Middle East.
Very well. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that. Journalist and Middle East analyst Hafsa Kara-Mustapha with her comments from London, and independent scholar Peter Sena. Thank you so much for your comments. He spoke from New York. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kara-Mustapha, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.